Hello, my name is Lisa Acuff, and I'm the Health Sciences Librarian at Harding University. Today, I'm going to demonstrate how I read and interpret medical literature. But first things first, why even bother reading medical literature? As health professionals, we're already very busy and pulled in many directions. However, it's important to read scientific articles so we can apply new information to meet our patients' needs. Now, when I say medical literature, I mean scientific journals and articles. Before I begin reading, first I must decide what to read. There are over 2 million biomedical articles published every year, so I can't possibly read them all. Therefore, I start with the journal most relevant to my area and one that has a solid reputation. Journals with high impact factors are good places to start because they're highly cited. Today, I'm going to read an article from the New England Journal of Medicine. This is one of the top journals in the medical community. After I pick a journal, I identify interesting articles by their titles and abstracts. I also take a quick look at the tables and figures, and then I pick an article to read. Now, I'll demonstrate some techniques for reading and interpreting an article called A Randomized Controlled Trial of 3 milligrams of liraglutide in Weight Management, published in 2016 in the New England Journal of Medicine. There are many questions I ask myself when reading. These questions came from a textbook called Research and Medical Literature for Health Professionals. It's a very handy reference. First, I consider the source of the article. What is the reputation of the journal? As I mentioned earlier, the New England Journal of Medicine is one of the top journals in the medical community, and it has a high impact factor. This means that articles in this journal are often cited by other researchers. Second, I ask if articles in this journal are peer-reviewed. The answer to this question is yes for the New England Journal of Medicine. Peer review means that manuscripts are critiqued by other experts before being published. Third, I consider the authors. Who are the authors and what are their affiliations? I find the authors listed below the title. I notice there are many authors for this article, and most of them have MDs. This might mean that the research interpretations reflect a clinical mindset. At the end of the author list, I learn that the authors are part of an obesity study group. And at the end of the abstract, I read that Novo Nordisk funded the research. Now, I want to learn more about Novo Nordisk, so I look it up on Google. And I learn that it's a diabetes healthcare company that produces products and conducts research. Liraglutide, mentioned in the article's title, is one drug produced by this company. I learned this by looking the drug up in a research database called Lexicomp. I'm going to keep this in mind as I read on, because Novo Nordisk could have a vested interest in the research results. Moving right along. Fourth, I ask, what is the main subject or topic of the study? I can learn this either from the abstract or from the short introduction. I see that the study is about liraglutide. Fifth, I think about the research problem. What problem was studied? I read the introduction and I learn that obesity is increasing, and this has health consequences. The research reported in this article addresses the problem by looking at liraglutide for weight management. Sixth, I consider the purpose or rationale for the study. The final sentence in the introduction states the aim: to evaluate the efficacy and safety of liraglutide for weight management in overweight or obese adults without diabetes. Okay, now I take a breath before moving on to the methods section. Sometimes I find it helpful to stand up and walk around. When I'm ready to move on, I look at the research participants. This is in the methods section. Who constituted the sample or population? I find this information in the methods subsection, patients. In the very first sentence, I learn that the trial enrolled overweight or obese adults 18 years or older with a stable body weight. All patients provided written consent before participation, and this is good. I also need to know how many participants were in the trial. This is the sample size. In the methods subsection, statistical analysis, I learned that the researchers' goal was to include 3,600 patients. The researchers used a power analysis to come up with this number. Then, later on in the results section, I find the number of patients who actually participated. There were 3,731 total. 2,487 were in the experimental group, and 1,244 were in the control or placebo group. I also learn by reading that the two groups had similar characteristics at the start of the trial. This is very important and one of the many benefits of randomization. Eighth, I consider the study design. This study used a randomized control trial, or RCT for short. I learn about the randomization in the methods subsection, study design. I remember that RCTs provide a high level of evidence, and they are considered the gold standard in medical research. If I don't recognize the study design, I refer to a textbook or library resource. It's very important to understand the overall design because it relates to the results and the interpretations. Also, every study design has limitations to consider. 9. I think about the statistical analyses. I find this information in the methods subsection, statistical analysis. Here, the statistical tests are described. An analysis of covariance model was used for continuous outcomes, and logistic regression was used for dichotomous outcomes. I remember the levels of measurement, like continuous or dichotomous, from my biostats class. These levels must match the appropriate statistical test. The authors also described a sensitivity analysis. Now, I'm not familiar with this, so I grab my biostats text for a quick review. Now, it's time for another mental break. Here's a quick joke to lighten things up. Why were the little strawberries upset? Because their parents were in a jam. Okay, we're moving right along. It's time for the results. Results are sometimes called findings. This section describes the participants, or the patients, and it reports data. It presents results of the statistical tests for each outcome variable. This section also includes tables. Tables complement the research text, and they do not simply repeat data. I often go back and forth between text and tables. I begin by asking myself, what are the results, and are they clear? Sometimes I read the text first, and other times I look at the tables. This time, I'll refer to the tables first. Table 1 presents the baseline characteristics of the patients. This is evident from the table's title. The two study groups are compared on several characteristics. On the left, I see the list of characteristics. Under the table, there are notes with explanations. I read these to help me interpret the table. I go on to glance at other tables and figures, always referring to another outside resource if I have questions. I remember that I don't have to know everything in order to get something out of an article, and I can always ask an instructor or colleague for help. After reviewing the tables, I read the text in the results section. The results are organized by study endpoint, beginning with the primary endpoints. This article uses the term endpoint, but I often see the word outcome used as well. Outcome, endpoint, and dependent variable are all the same. I consider whether the results answer the research questions. I go back to the study's aim to remind myself of the primary research question. What is the efficacy and safety of liraglutide for weight management among overweight or obese adults? The results presented in this article do answer this question. Finally, the last thing I consider about the results is validity. In other words, do they make sense and are they persuasive? There are many kinds of validity in scientific research. I'm almost done. The discussion is the last section, and it's sometimes called conclusions. This section reports the author's interpretations of the data or results. An important thing to remember is that the conclusions should logically flow from the data. They should not simply summarize the results. The conclusions should also be consistent with the overall study design and analyses. The discussion section can be open to misinterpretation. That's why it's very important to consider these things. Okay, I'll leave you with a few final thoughts, and these are my favorite because they bring the article back to application. This is when I relate the research to my own work. I ask myself what the results mean to healthcare, medicine, me, and my clinical practice. Do the results from this study apply to my patients? I also consider my patients' well-being. And finally, I think about feasibility. Can the results be applied to my clinical practice? In other words, can I replicate them in my setting? Reading medical literature is challenging, but it gets easier with practice. And it's exciting to learn new information in the medical field. Thank you for sharing this time with me, and happy reading.